You would, oh, thank you. Thank you, Jean, for remembering that. So everyone, if you put your mouse towards the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see some controls there. Please stay muted during the webinar, at least until the very end Q&A session, just to reduce background noise. However, do feel free to turn on your video. That way presenters can see their audience a little bit. So if you just click on the stop or start video, that'll turn your video on and off. You can also click on participants to turn that screen on and off, and as well as chat. So if once we start screen sharing, if you need a little more room to see the screen, then closing those might help that a little bit. You can also drag on the right. If you put your mouse towards the right of a shared screen, there should be a gray bar that you can drag to make that a little bit bigger. Any questions that come to mind at any point, please put them in the chat box. We will make sure we get to them at the end of the session, if not before that. Please don't be shy. If you're thinking of a question, the odds are that there's someone else thinking of that question too. So definitely feel free to share what you're thinking. If you don't want everyone to see your chat, Joe Bunnell is our moderator tonight. So you can send it privately to him and he'll share your question with the group. We are recording this, so we'll share the link at some point after that. It'll be on our website, so you can view that later. We will also share the slides and some additional resources by email after all these webinars are over. So don't worry if you've missed something, or if you want to come back and look at this later, it'll be available again. I'd like to give a big thank you to the team that made this possible. So Jean Schrieffer, Josh Camps, and Joe Bunnell from UW-Madison Division of Extension, Linda Schweiker and Todd Jensen from Grant and Greene County Conservation Departments, and Dan Smith and Jamie Patton from the UW-Madison Nutrient and Pest Management Program. Are all played an integral part in bringing this to us today. Let's see, anything I forgot? I don't think so. So today we're covering the topics of soil health and the practices, rules, and considerations around protecting soil and water. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Joe to introduce our first speaker.
Yeah, and I'm going to be real quick. Jamie, I'm going to let you do any intro background that you would like to do, but our first presenter is Jamie Patton. She's going to talk about soil health.
Let me unmute myself. So perfect. Hopefully you see the correct screen. Nod. Excellent. Yes. All right. So my name is Jamie Patton. I'm a soil scientist with the Nutrient and Pest Management Program. So I'm going to try and be as brief as possible tonight, but I will let you know that 30 minutes is a pretty short time for me to get to talk about soils. I could talk for days and days and days. And is my screen not moving forward? So technical difficulties already right off the start. All right, let me try this again. So, all right, can you see this?
Not yet.
Anyone? Not yet. All right. So as I fiddle with this, let me chat with you. So soil health, when we talk about soil health, its definition is kind of up in the air as we start to move around. We're still, as scientists, trying to decide what soil health actually means. But the NRCS has come up with a definition for us. And for some reason, my Zoom is going really poorly tonight. Let me shut all this down. All right, we'll start again. So the NRCS has come up with a definition for us. And basically, it talks about soil being functioning as a living system. And that's something that we haven't thought about in the past, is soil being alive. So most of us, when we think about soil, we think about it as minerals, we think about it as rocks, but we never think about it as a living organism. And so that's the new way that we're starting to think about soil health. So tonight, in this brief 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about the soil health concept, how this soil health impacts agricultural productivity, and how we can think about soil health on your land. So in general, I love to talk about the driftless area because your area is absolutely gorgeous. So I was born and raised in Iowa, just off the driftless area. And when we think about it, these soils are so old. They're pre-Illinoisan, so that's a soil geek term for really old in this area. So they're almost 800,000 years old. And when we think about how those soils functioned over time, they were mostly developed under savanna. So there's these beautiful trees and mixed grass understory with forbs. And I threw up a picture there of the Fayette silt loam. So these beautiful silt loam soils with a nice thick dark A horizon. These soils functioned without management for hundreds of thousands of years. And when we talk about soil health, this is what we're actually thinking about, is how that soil functions on its own. How does it maintain not only plant productivity, making sure that we're producing those tons and tons of tree biomass, grass biomass, but also how are we producing all that biomass under the ground, that biology, those bacteria, the fungi, the actinomycetes, all of these wonderful words that we talk about, but those small living organisms that we can't see without a microscope. So, yeah.
I just want you to know that I think we may be seeing the presenter view of your
All right. This is so I apologize, everyone. So how about this?
That's
So that's better. So I apologize. So we even tried, that's the wonderful thing about Zoom and working from home. So even if we ran this right before this meeting, it still decided to have a mind of its own. So I apologize there.
Yeah,
But
now we're only seeing a portion of the slide.
son of a gun. All right.
Jamie, do you want me to try and run it here and then you just tell me when to forward?
All right. What are you seeing?
We're getting the.
It's like the upper left corner of the slide. It seems.
Yeah, go ahead, Jean. I was to say, go ahead and see if you can share. So when we talk about these soils, and I apologize, like I said, it was working 5 minutes ago. When we think about these soils, this is the cool thing, and this is what landowners don't think about, is it being a living being. And when we think about living beings, what do they need to live? They need food, they need water, they need air, and they need shelter. And that is the role of soils. In order to function, in order to cycle nutrients, in order to provide water for those plants, we as land stewards have to make sure that those soil organisms, which are integral to that process, are getting that food, that water, that air that they need. Okay, so next, Jean.
Oh, sure. Oop, there we go.
There we go. So what is soil health? As I said, the NRCS defines it as the capacity of the soil to function as a living organism. So again, not thinking about it as rocks, as I have down in that bottom left-hand corner, but instead thinking of it as being alive. Next, Jean. So why that's important to us, and
did I go too far?
Nope, you're good. So
Okay.
what does this healthy soil provide? So it provides the wants. And I like wants as an acronym when we start to think about soil. So what wants stands for is water. So what do plants need? Water, air, nutrients, toxin and temperature regulation. They need a nice home, right? And structure for support. So we look to that soil to provide those plants its wants. We also look to that soil, a good healthy soil, to provide sufficient nutrition and nutritious food and feed. So if you're following the soil health movement, we're talking a lot about the differences in forage production. We're talking a lot about the nutritious value of foods produced in healthy soils versus those that are not healthy. And I can tell you, I see the difference up here. I'm sitting up in Northeast Wisconsin. On a healthy soil, how much biomass can I produce versus on an unhealthy soil? And it tends to be difference in tons per acre. And so it's very important to maintain this soil's ability to function in order to meet our demands for not only food and feed. It's important in clean water and air. So you, much like Northeast Wisconsin up here, we're looking at a threat to groundwater quality. We're looking at these nitrates. We're looking at contamination by enteric bacteria. So how do we help keep those out of the groundwater? A lot of that has to do with the filtration and the storage capacity of the soil itself. We got to make sure it provides a suitable habitat for these organisms, and a healthy soil also reduces the needs for inputs, and that may be labor inputs, it may be nutrient inputs, it may be pesticide inputs, it may be seed inputs. So it depends upon what we're talking about, but a good healthy soil is going to reduce the need for many of those factors that are required in a more highly intensive agricultural system. Next. So what does an agricultural soil look like? So I put up that picture of that savanna, and I love to look at that. So when you think about how a savanna functions over the year, it maintains cover, right? So there's always something on the ground. There's always residue, whether it be alive or dead, helping to provide food and provide shelter and provide basically a cover for that soil that helps it resist erosion. It also maintains living plants all year long. So even though they've gone dormant, those plants are still alive and those root systems are still very, very active. And we know that the soil organisms that are so important to soil health feed near those root systems. Those roots are leaking sugars. I love to think about this concept because it is really strange to me, but what plants actually do is they leak up to 60% of the sugar that they make through photosynthesis. So as those plants capture that sunlight and they produce sugar for themselves, they can leak up to 60%. They just exude that sugar out into the soil system. And they feed the microorganisms. And they do that because those microorganisms are so beneficial in nutrient cycling, right? Helping that plant get the nutrients it needs. So it's so important that we maintain a food source for those organisms. And in a natural system, we do that through living cover all year long. And in an agricultural system, we're going to do the same thing. That natural system includes diverse plants, and it includes soil disturbances that are more natural, earthworm activity, right, versus tillage. So that natural system looks very, very different in that savanna versus what an agricultural system does. And so is that agricultural system able to provide the food, the water, the air, and the shelter that we need? So there are many key concepts to what a healthy soil contains, but we're going to cover just a few tonight. And I'm going to focus on, because when we think about landowners, I'm going to try and put some fuzzy, I call them fuzzy dollar signs to some of these soil health factors. And the first soil health factor we're going to talk about is soil organic matter. And I cannot, go ahead, and next. So I cannot talk about how important soil organic matter is. I put that key there because soil organic matter is the key to soil health. And the reason for that is that it is controlling many of the biological, physical, and chemical factors in the soil. So when we think about how a soil functions and what its role is in the ecosystem, that biological function, that organic matter is acting as a food source for those soil microorganisms. Those soil microorganisms are helping to produce the glues that help to create those pore spaces. And the pore spaces are where that water and the air move in and out of our soils. So the organisms are key in creating that pore space. They're key in cycling those nutrients. So releasing those nutrients from the manures, releasing them from the composts and the organic matter and the crop residues that we have out there. That organic matter is key in providing exudates. We call them exudates that help to foster the entire system. That organic matter, again, is you'll see under physical properties. So this is where soil aggregates, and this is, people always laugh because I get really excited about soil aggregates. So when I fall asleep at night, this is what I dream of, these beautiful, small, little crumble, cookie crumb structure, or that chocolate cake structure, or those little balls that you see at the surface of a beautiful prairie soil. They just filter through your fingers. That's what we want to see in a healthy soil. And we only get those little spherical structures. We only get that good structure when we have lots of organic matter. We get it because that organic matter is acting as a glue that helps to bind those aggregates together. When we think about that, that's so important to a healthy soil because we need those tiny little balls in the soil. So when we think about packing a box, a cube full of shapes, I need my soil to be spheres. I need those PEDs, those aggregates, whatever you want to call them, to be spheres. Because when we think about packing, right, basketballs in a box, right, inflated basketballs in a box. So some of you are, outsmart me sometimes. So we'll make sure those balls are inflated. Inflated basketballs in a box, right? They don't fit that well together. We have tons and tons of empty space in there. That's what we want to see in the soil. So when we have that tiny little granular structure, we end up with tons of empty space. That's where our microorganisms live. That's where our earthworms are crawling through. That's where our roots are growing. That's where we're storing some of our water, and that's where we're storing our air. So that those spheres are very important. We don't want to see blocks, because if we try and pack that box full of Rubik's cubes, it packs pretty tightly. And we can't have that, because then that water air movement, that root growth, that biological activity is impaired. So that organic matter helps to create those tiny little spheres and improve our physical properties. And that organic matter, you'll see these big words under chemical properties: cation exchange capacity, right? So that's an abstract thought, But what it's really talking about is soils are charged. If you didn't know, soils are predominantly negatively charged. And that is so important to life on Earth, because what those negative charges do is they hold nutrients to them. They hold nutrients to the soil, kind of like they hold a magnet to a magnet holds to a refrigerator, right? So they come off and on. And that's so important for us when we talk about plant productivity, because if those nutrients were not attracted to the soil and attracted those cation exchange sites, they would always be out in the pore space. And every time it rains, they would just leach away. So over time, we would lose all of our nutrients. So that idea of that cation exchange capacity, the soil being able to hold on to those nutrients, is key to maintaining life. And where does that cation exchange capacity come from? Lo and behold, it comes from clay, but it also comes from organic matter. Next. So when we talk about soil organic matter, and when we think about agricultural productivity and reducing those inputs over time, it is estimated that 1% organic matter contains about 1,000 pounds of N, 100 pounds of P, 100 pounds of K, and 100 pounds of sulfur. That is a lot of nutrition for those plants. Those are key components of the fertility. Those are the macronutrients that are required, so the nutrients that are needed in really large amounts by those plants. And when we think about that natural savanna, this is why your soils were so productive. Is your soils in that area oftentimes probably had 3, 5, 7, maybe even more % organic matter in those soils. And that high % organic matter cycled these nutrients and provided productivity. And you'll see in these two pictures that I provided, I took both of these pictures. The one on the top, you'll notice it has, for those of you who are soil geeks, it's a very distinct line. It's an AP horizon, but notice how deep, dark, rich, and black that soil is. That is a high organic matter soil. And then you compare that to the one down below it. Both of these soils are agricultural soils, but the one down below it, you'll notice that it looks strange, right? You notice that the subsoil, so the soil down below underneath the surface, is darker than the soil at the surface. And this is due to tillage. So over time, what happens is when we till the soil, we facilitate the loss. So we increase the loss of organic matter from that soil. And this soil has been tilled so much and has been basically farmed hard, quote unquote, for so long that it's lost the organic matter at the soil surface. The soil can't function anymore. And you notice how it looks like a big clod. Jean? And so what is this worth to us? If we start to put, I told you I was going to put dollar signs to this. When we look at this, and I just estimated some costs, every 1% organic matter, realize we don't get all of these nutrients all at once, but that 1% organic matter is worth about $530 to us. It's a large amount of money for every 1% organic matter. Next. So what does it also mean? And there's a lot of argument about this slide within the soils world of how much impact soil organic matter has on water holding capacity, but we know that organic matter acts as a sponge. And the more organic matter that we have in the soil, the better capacity we have to store water. So what you're looking at, and I always hate to show you charts and graphs, but what it's showing you is for every one increase in % organic matter, how many more days of plant available water you have as compared to 0% organic matter. So you'll notice that 1% organic matter has about 1 day more of the required water required for a corn crop. If you have 2% organic matter, you gain about 3 additional days before you introduce water stress or water deficit into that plant. Organic matter, 3% organic matter, 4 to 5 days. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when we think about, as we're standing here with our fingers crossed, waiting for that next rain, when we're in a drought situation, the longer that we can delay true water stress and hitting, yield loss from that water stress, the better we are to withstand those differences in rainfall events and that time between rainfall events. Next. So what does this mean for yield? So if you go back in there, that 1% organic matter, I apologize, this is just not my night. My dog is now eating my papers. All right, here we go. All right, so when we look at that 1% organic matter, it gives us about 1.5 days of water before we hit water stress. If you look at the irrigation scheduling, oftentimes in corn, for example, there's up to 7% yield loss with 4 days of water stress. What does a 7% yield loss in corn look like? It might be around 12 bushels. But if we start to put numbers to that, when we look at that 1% organic matter increase from maybe 3 to 4%, right, and we gain those additional days, we're looking at significant dollar signs associated with that change in potential yield. And basically, this is a yield savings over time due to reduced water stress. Next. I like this graph, and this has to do with cover crops, but it helps to drive home that point again. I said I was going to talk in dollar signs. What you're looking at is table 4 from basically Cover Crop Economics. It's put out by the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Group. And what I want you to focus on is that purple line. And what that purple line is showing you is the income from extra yield in a drought year. So it's getting back at how do healthy soils function differently than non-healthy soils when we're under times of stress, and this happens to be water stress. You'll notice, and we're going to go all the way to the end, so it's the years of cover cropping. So after 5 years of introducing a cover crop into your crop rotation, as you've improved that soil health over time, what I want you to notice is that adjusted net return. So soils that have been under cover crops for 5 years see an increase in net return of $110 per acre versus those that aren't cover cropped. Okay, it's $110 per acre. Right? It's incredible. And you saw this, many of you, so in the droughts of 2012, right? So those soils, and you can go back and you can look at the data, healthy soils had a crop yield that year. Unhealthy soils didn't. I was in Missouri at the time, and I can tell you that it was so dry, even our weeds didn't produce seeds that year. But there were fields that did have crops, that did yield. And those were the soils that were healthy, that had been managed in a way to optimize organic matter contents. Next. So what is your soil organic matter? As a landowner, I'm just kind of talking these numbers, right? But we have hard data. We know what the soil organic matter levels of our soils are, because that is part of a routine soil test. So knowing what it is important to us, and we can monitor that over time. So soil organic matter loss is super easy. I could have you lose 1% organic matter in about a year. That's not a big deal. I can tell you how to do that. Let's not, but I could, right? But I am going to have a harder time getting you to increase 1% organic matter. It's going to take some time, all right? It's going to take maybe 5 years. It's going to take 7 years. It's going to take 10 years, depending upon the management practice we employ. But it is worth the wait to gain that 1% organic matter. And as a landowner, as you're watching those numbers change, like I said, we can monitor those over time, and it gives us an idea of how our management practices are impacting soil health. We can do that through, as I said, routine soil tests, and we can do that through SNAP Plus. Jean? So what is SNAP Plus? So I think Dan last time talked a little bit about nutrient management. So with their nutrient management, many of our farms have nutrient management plans. And there so happens to be, after we develop that nutrient management plan, there's a report called the Soil Conservation Report. And in that report, there's a number, and it says SCI. And many people don't know what that means. But in that report, the SCI is called the Soil Conditioning Index. And it gives me an idea of how my crop rotation, my tillage practices, how my inputs are affecting soil organic matter over time. If I have 0, right, if the SCI is 0, that means that I'm not changing organic matter. It's not increasing, but it's not decreasing. If it's above 0, that means that my soil organic matter levels are increasing. And if it's below 0, it tells me that over time, I'm actually losing soil organic matter through my agricultural practices. And so this report, you can, depending upon what the crop rotations are, you can see whether or not, by models, whether our soil organic matter increasing or decreasing, and we can change our management practices to ensure that this number is positive, and that we're seeing the environmental and the soil health returns that we want from these practices. Next. Next, we'll go through the next slide. I'm already out of time. See, I guess this is all exciting, right? So what else do we look for in a healthy soil? Life, right? This is my most fun, my funnest, whatever the proper English term is for that, right? I love to go out with a shovel and show you life in your soil. And it's very easy to see, right? So next. So what do you look for? So I usually spend my time standing in a soil pit. I stand in holes in the ground most of the year. And this is what I want to see in a good, healthy soil, right? Take a shovel out and dig down. See how those management practices are impacting what's going down below. So the picture on the left, you see this beautiful, right? When you look at it, you see those little balls that I was talking about, that granular structure. You see tons of root, fine root growth. This is a good, healthy soil. In the middle picture, what do you see? You see these big earthworm channels, and you see these big earthworm, basically castings, right? So that's what they're called. There's casting. That's earthworm poop inside that channel. And I love to see that, right? Because that earthworm, those earthworm casts are full of nutrients. And that is helping to provide fertility for my plants. And you'll notice in the picture on the right, those earthworm channels, but you'll notice why I love earthworm channels is you'll notice those plant roots, they always take the path of least resistance. So the more earthworms I can have in a soil, the more earthworm channels I have, the better my crop root growth is going to be. And you'll notice in that one channel, there's just tons of roots packed right in there. It's helping those roots get down into the soil, in the soil subsoil, to get that moisture, to get those nutrients, to help that crop withstand drop stress, to help it become a healthy plant because it's getting the resources that it needs in order to grow. Right. So this is where something that you can see. You can also gauge soil biology when you look at your field by how fast is your crop residue decomposing, right? If the crop residue is gone like this, you know you have increased biological activity because it's cycling, it's eating it, it's just making it go away. If that crop residue sits there for years and years and years, you know that the biology isn't as good as it should be. You can also smell a soil, right? So I encourage you to go out into your land and just pick it up. If it smells like a warm spring rain, right? That's what we want soil to smell like. It's called geosmin. It's a chemical produced by those soil microorganisms. So if you get that warm, earthy smell, that's ideal. If it doesn't smell, that's kind of like eh. And if it smells moldy or musty, that's a eh. We don't want our soils to smell that way. That means that they're probably compacted and they're holding too much water. And you can also count the number of earthworms per shovel to gauge some of that soil biology. Next. When we talk about healthy soils, this is another one of my passions, is compaction. So we always underestimate how compaction impacts how that soil cycles. Next. So when we think about that compaction, right? I'm a visual person, right? So if you look at that soil on the left, again, that's that beautiful, healthy soil that I showed you in that little picture before. You see that beautiful root growth. And then you compare that to the soil on the right. So I can tell you the soil on the left was taken on Kewaunee County, and the soil on the right was taken in Green Lake County. So that was a really fun field day in Green Lake County because you notice it looks like a solid chunk, right? It's just massive, right? And I was actually able, and it was a good field day, teaching field day, because I found a crack and I pushed my hands in it and I lifted the entire topsoil up as one solid mass. So if you think about soil being that compact, you can notice there are hardly any roots. There's hardly any biology. You don't see any earthworms. The crops here were suffering because they couldn't get the nutrients, the water, the root penetration that they needed to persist. So compaction has a tremendous impact on crop yields. This soil on the right, because it doesn't get plant growth, is more susceptible to erosion, which is another we're going to talk about here quickly in a second. Jean? This is, if I said I dream about soil aggregates, I have nightmares about this, right? Soil rutting. So why this causes me so much angst is surface compaction. So if we smash the soil at the surface, it's bad, right? Don't get me wrong, it's bad. But through freeze thaw, through plant root growth, through microbial activity, it will go away over time. But as soon as we start to get compaction at depth, so as soon as compaction starts to occur 8-10 inches into the ground, you might as well kiss it goodbye because there's nothing you're going to do to fix that. Even subsoiling is not going to help you very much. It just temporarily solves a problem, but you're still going to have the problem that you have there. Next, Jean. And what I'm talking about is you'll see that plow pan. So on the left-hand side, you can see how there's a solid mass right there about 6 to 8 inches underneath the ground. And you'll notice that there are those roots that you see dangling down were actually growing sideways. They were coming out at me. They're now just dangling down because the roots couldn't penetrate it. Water doesn't move in there. we get excess erosion off of that land. We get less productivity off that land. And in the right-hand picture, you'll notice that poor little radish root, right? Everybody says the radishes reduce compaction. Well, we can try, but if it's so compact, you'll notice that root grows down, then all of a sudden it's called J-rooting. It hits that compacted layer and it says, no, and it grows back up and it grows sideways then. It won't go through that compacted layer. When we think about crop productivity, this is not an ideal situation to be because any water, any nutrient down below that level is inaccessible by that plant. And we're going to have issues with runoff. We're going to have issues with erosion. We're going to have issues in producing that plant. Next.
Jamie, you got 5 minutes.
All right, we got this. All right, so compaction. All right. How much, this is why I stay awake at night. Compaction can cause 25 to 50% yield loss. We never think about that. 50% of your crop is gone due to compaction if it's heavily compacted. What does that mean for us? Well, if we use that same scenario, 170 bushel at $4 corn, it's about $170 in loss per year. In addition, I'm going to have to try and till it oftentimes to try and get rid of it. I increase my tillage cost just simply because it requires more energy for me to get that tractor and that implement through the ground. Right? You'll notice in this picture, again, you'll notice that surface is solid, right? There's only a couple cracks in there. This is what we see with surface compaction. Next, and as I talked about, that subsurface compaction is there basically for the rest of our lives. It's very, very hard for nature to take care of compaction at depth. And what this graph is showing you is the years after the compaction event. So it gives you 5 years after the compaction event and 10 years after the compaction event. What I want you to notice is even 10 years after that compaction event, 10 years after that rutting situation, we have leveled out and we're still only achieving about 95 to 97% of our normal yield. We've lost 3% of production forever, right? That soil is forever going to have a reduced yield because of that singular compaction event, because we can't get rid of it and nature's not going to get rid of it in the short term. So what does that look like? Again, cumulative loss over the 10 years, if you start to use the same assumptions that we've used, cumulative loss over 10 years is about $480 in lost yield over 10 years. Our sustained loss, because that lasts for perpetuity, is about $20 per acre per year. Right? Imagine event after event after event creating more and more and more compaction, reducing yield more and more and more, reducing profitability more and more and more. And I realize I'm talking crop productivity and your landowners that may be renting this ground out, but it's your land, right? Your land has suddenly became less productive forever. So these are things to think about. Next. We also want to have little erosion. Next. And in your area with these steep slopes, this is tremendous. And I'll just quickly go through this. So when we look at some of the studies that we've done up here in Northeast Wisconsin, we know that rainfall events are becoming more intense. And because of that, we are requiring our soils to take in or infiltrate more water more quickly, more often. So when we looked at how fast water would move into a soil up here under permanent vegetation, so this was a prairie on the Green Bay campus, it was able to accept 10 inches of rainfall per hour, soaked in, didn't run off. In a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, it only accepted about 4 inches of water per hour. Next. So what does that mean? That means 6.7 inches of water potentially ran off. Okay. Why is that important to us? Well, in any water erosion situation, it only takes about 1/10 of an inch of water to initiate water erosion. And we're running off an excess 6.7 inches as compared. Next. In addition, what we're going to see in those unhealthy soils, the next slide is going to talk about aggregate stability. So what is aggregate stability? It's that ability of that little ball to stay as a ball and make it less susceptible to erosion. What you're going to see, and my PowerPoint just is angry tonight, is the next slide will tell you that under that permanent vegetation, we have about 97% of the aggregates are stable, but only 60% or so are stable underneath a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. What does that mean for us? It means that about I think the number was 26% of our aggregates were unstable. Next slide. Under that agricultural situation. And what that translates to is 77 tons of soil that are more susceptible to erosion because that soil is less healthy, because those aggregates are less able to withstand a wetting and drying process. What does that mean for us? It means more erosion. On average in southern Wisconsin, we're looking at 3 to 8 tons of soil being lost per acre per year. What does that mean? Well, when we factor in yield losses and decreased water quality, it's about $7 per ton. So on average, about $56 per ton per acre per year is being lost in that system because of lost productivity from erosion. But again, thinking long term, because we've lost that productivity from erosion this time, we're now looking at a 3 to 7% decline in land value. So over time, if your land was valued at $4,000 per acre, a 3% loss is $120. This is not over the whole life of the soil. This is every year because you're losing 3 to 8 tons per acre per year. This is $120 per acre per year in lost land value.
Jamie, we're right at 30 minutes.
Okay, so last but not least, we'll put there. So we've talked a lot of, next slide, Jean. Next slide, Jean. What you're gonna see is all of these things we talked about were $415 per acre per year of loss in a non-healthy soil versus a healthy soil. So if I have to put numbers, there's my numbers. How do you improve this? And then the next slide is the soil health management system. Oh, next slide. You don't want to see that, right? Is the soil health management systems. So I think the next speaker probably will talk about this. I apologize, we ran short because of technical difficulties, but that's my spiel on soil health.
Thank you, Jamie.
You
We're
betcha.
gonna hold our questions till the end, but if you have other questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. And then we're gonna go on to Linda and Katie.
Can you guys all see that? Okay. Yes. Okay. Excellent. So yeah, Linda. So I'm Katie Abbott, the county conservationist for Iowa County, and Linda is going to be co-hosting this presentation. She's my counterpart in Grant County. So the first thing that I tend to recommend to any landowner when thinking about what to do on their land is think about your goals. So, look at this list, which of these are important to you, which ones are your priorities. For example, wildlife habitat has come up a couple of times. There is a way to have wildlife habitat and agriculture on the same field. For example, this photo is showing a prairie buffer strip, going in between different rows of crops, and that can provide some more water infiltration and some pollinator habitat. Do you plan on selling your land or transferring it to a family member, in 5 to 10 years? That might affect what you can commit to as far as programs go, or long-term leases or things like that. And how do you feel about the use of herbicides? Some landowners only want to rent to organic farmers and just realize that there's a trade-off there. Most organic farmers need to use additional tillage to control weeds if they don't use herbicides. So just keep that in mind as well when you're thinking about your goals. So being clear on the goals in your own mind and with your renter can really help you make decisions moving forward. And then think about different options, particularly on any fields that are environmentally sensitive, might be low productivity, may be small or hard to reach with farmers' big equipment or something like that. Then you might want to think about some alternatives to row cropping. So, looking at some of those soils maps that Josh talked about on Monday, and keeping the best ground perhaps for the cropping, and putting some of the others into some alternate uses that we have listed here. For example, the Conservation Reserve Program provides annual payments in exchange for long-term grass, and that does stay as agriculture for your property taxes. So there's a lot of different uses, even small areas in the right places, like a buffer strip along a stream, can have a sizable impact on water quality, soil health, and a little bit of wildlife habitat too. And then, for the areas that you are going to have row crops particularly, or any sort of more intensive ag, then that's when you start to think about what are some of these conservation practices that can be implemented to help protect that soil and water. So I am going to turn that over to Linda then. To jump in and talk about that.
Okay, so talking about conservation practices, we also talk about conservation rules and regulations, and it's not necessarily the fun part of the presentation, but always good for the landowners to know what regulations are out there, even though that you're not the operator. If there is a violation of a statewide performance standard, it actually comes down to the landowner, not necessarily the operator, who would be held accountable for these standards. So we felt it would be important to let you know what these standards are and what practices would be useful to remedy these situations. Cost sharing may be available to assist with compliance. However, there are statewide programs, state and local programs, where cost sharing is not necessarily required. Farmland preservation, your tax credit is considered your cost share, and so everyone in farmland preservation needs to be in compliance. And there's also specific county ordinances that might supersede the requirement to provide cost sharing. But always, check with your conservation office to see what programs and funding is available. Who do the statewide performance standards apply to? It's farmers who grow agricultural crops. So if crops are being grown on your land, these standards apply to you. Farmers who raise, feed, or house livestock. So anyone who has livestock on their land, these performance standards apply. And then farmers who have or plan to build waste storage facilities need to meet standards. And farmers in a water quality management area. I know this screen is kind of busy, but it kind of breaks it down into little pieces of what a water quality management area is. Facilities that are 300 feet to a stream need to pay attention what's going on in that area. Things that are more difficult to see, 2 feet to groundwater or 2 feet to bedrock. 250 feet to a private well. We want to be taking that into consideration, and 1,000 feet to a municipal well if you're farming on the outskirts of a city, and then 300 feet to a sinkhole. And then, as I mentioned before, farmers who participate in the Farmland Preservation Program. This is a map of the 4 counties that we've been focusing on tonight. In the light green areas, those are the townships that have farmland preservation zoning. So any landowners in those shaded green areas are eligible for farmland preservation. If you're in one of these yellow slashed areas, those are called ag enterprise areas, and those landowners are also eligible. And then you see these little dots kind of speckled across some of the counties. Those are farmers pre-2009 that signed long-term farmland preservation agreements, and those landowners as well would be eligible for farmland preservation and would require them all to meet the statewide performance standards before claiming their tax credit. And then, as I mentioned, landowners and counties with ordinances. This is a map of all the counties in the state of Wisconsin with manure storage ordinances. And then you want to check specifically with your counties to see who has maybe a little bit more specific ordinances pertaining to statewide performance standards. So what specifically are the statewide performance standards? The number one standard is all farmers must meet tolerable soil loss. So as Jamie was talking about, we don't want to see erosion on our fields. Each soil type has a tolerable soil loss, and they need to be farming to a rotation that prevents soil from leaving your field. We don't want the soil leaving our field. To meet tolerable soil loss, in addition to crop rotations, we like to look at contour strip cropping, contour buffer strips, no-till, cover crops, grassed waterways, and possibly end rows and headlands, buffering them. We also want to prevent direct runoff from feedlots or stored manure into waters of the state. We definitely don't want to see what is happening in these pictures. We want to divert clean water around the feedlots and keep it out of the water quality management areas with roof gutters, with diversions, and possibly underground outlets. In this situation, this concrete wall is acting as a diversion. The water's collecting here in this grate and being diverted through the barnyard, outside the barnyard. So all this clean water is not going through the barnyard. Anyone who builds waste storage facilities needs to build them according to standards. We want to make sure we have warning signs. We want to make sure that they're designed and constructed according to standards, and making sure that they're placed in environmentally protected areas. Not environmentally protecting the areas. We also want to stack manure outside of a water quality management area. In this picture here, we have manure stacked in a quarry. Obviously, the quarry was mined down to the bedrock. We don't want to see that. We want to be siting, stacking areas on flat areas, ridgetop areas outside of waterways, areas where if water comes in contact with the stacked manure, that it's not running off into waterways and streams. We want to obviously prevent overtopping of waste storage facilities, and storage facilities constructed now have what's called a maximum operating level. It's supposed to be marked on the facility. This gives landowners a buffer in case at the time of spreading we're having unseasonably wet weather. It gives them a little leeway that they can get that manure spread before it overtops. We also want to repair leaking waste storage facilities. We don't want to see cracks in our concrete walls or discharges from our storage facilities. Performance standards also, if they want to close a waste storage facility, it needs to be closed according to standards. We need to make sure that we empty the facilities according to standards, get the liners pulled out, remove all contamination from those sites, either earthen or concrete, and then make sure that we grade the sites so that water does not pond and percolate through these soils after the facility's been closed. Also, landowners need to develop and follow a nutrient management plan. This entails taking soil samples, taking account for where you're spreading your manure, and also taking account of where you're spreading your chemical fertilizers, your nitrogen and phosphorus coming from the agronomist. Take all those into consideration along with your crop rotation and working out a nutrient management plan. And then we want to maintain adequate sod along waters of the state. We're not saying that livestock are completely prohibited from the streams, but we want to make sure that the number out there is not completely denuding the vegetation along our streams, giving the livestock access, maybe letting them in periodically to graze down the banks, keeping them out, and moving them through the area so as not to completely eradicate the growth on the surface. Now Katie will take it over to show you what to look for when you're looking at your own land.
Okay, there we go. All right, so now that you know some of the standards and practices to look for, how do you know if there might be an issue, or what do you look for when what should you be looking for when you walk your land? So the first thing is the soil protected? You know, if you can see bare exposed soil, the chances are pretty good that the next heavy rain there's going to be erosion. You can see the picture of the raindrop there. You know, just the physical force of that raindrop can displace some of those soil particles and begin that erosion process. So the picture on the left is showing a really good cover of residue from the previous year's corn that is providing some physical barrier to that impact of that water. Cover crops can provide some of that protection as well. And then when you do get a heavier rain, take a look and see where that water is going. Can you see areas where, like on the bottom left, where the water is starting to concentrate as it moves through a field? That might be one area that could use a little bit more protection, perhaps a grassed waterway. Can you see that the soil is actually moving? Is there accumulating soil in the low spots, the corners of the field, or in the upper right, where the water is actually cutting a channel right through that field? There's not a lot of residue there. The corn's very small, not providing any protection, and you can see how that water just cut right through there. So there's going to we need some work in that area to protect that waterway. So keep an eye on if you do have manure spread on your land. farmers are allowed to spread on frozen ground or in the winter, but there are a few more limitations. So you can't spread manure on frozen ground within 300 feet of a stream or river. So that picture on the right, he's right up against that stream bank, and that's an issue that just has a much higher risk of that manure getting to that water system. And on steeper fields, there's also, it's not illegal to spread, but there's some additional practices that they have to do. So basically, you know, manure should stay put where it's put on the field. So if it's leaving the field, particularly if it's getting to a ditch or a waterway, that's an issue, and that can cause some pollution problems in that stream. So basically, you know, something to talk about your operator is, you know, are you going to spread in the winter? What's your plan? And just make sure they are following some of those restrictions. And kind of like Linda mentioned, if you have a stream running through your property or multiple streams, keep an eye on the condition of those banks. So if there's livestock, make sure they're not degrading it so much that there's no vegetation left, like the picture on the left. So in that picture, you know, we'd recommend building a stream crossing of rock for the cattle to get across without beating up the soil, and then fencing that off and putting some replanting vegetation to allow that to establish. On the right, the farmer is cropping way too close to that stream. There should be at least a 5-foot setback from the top of the bank to any tillage or planting. 5 is bare minimum. So, you know, some other programs might recommend 20 to 30 feet or more. So 5 is, like I said, just really the bare minimum. And, you know, if you do have a wider buffer, sometimes that can be grazed or hayed safely without too much problem. So there's some options there too. And then some other considerations, applying nitrogen in fall just has a higher risk of that nitrogen leaching into the groundwater than it would if it was applied in the spring. There's a few practices that farmers can do to try to reduce that risk, but it's just something to be aware of the timing of nutrient applications on your land. Similarly, tillage in the fall just has more risk of erosion because that soil is going to be exposed all fall, winter, and spring. And we've seen heavy rains all of these seasons. Even in winter, we might get a thaw and get some rain. So that just, again, it's just more risky and just something to think about. Like Dan Smith said on Monday, you know, tillage should have a purpose and shouldn't just be recreational for fun. So just something to be aware of and have a conversation about. And in general, you know, just think about your conservation goals. The state standards that Linda mentioned are minimum. So, you know, she mentioned the tolerable soil loss. That's still soil loss. And on some soils, it's allowed to go up to 3, 4 to 5 tons per acre per year. You're still losing quite a bit of soil. So, you know, think about it and talk to your renter about, do you want to try to get as close to zero as you can? And where to get help? You know, the good starting point is to talk to your operator. Farmers tend to be really good problem solvers. They're often innovative, inventive. If you talk over your concerns or questions or issues, there's a good chance that they'll be able to come up with some ideas to meet your goals and theirs at the same time. There might even be things they've been wanting to try and just, you know, didn't feel like they could do on rented land. So it's great to have these conversations. Also, all the folks here today leading this presentation from UW Extension and County Conservation Departments, we're here to help answer questions. I can't speak for Extension per se, but I know my county staff, you know, we can sit down and go over your nutrient management plan. We can meet you on site with or without your operator there too, to talk about any questions, issues, concerns. We can do a walkover of your property. You know, we have cost sharing at the county to help implement some of these practices. So there's a lot of options out there to get some more advice if you need it. Also, there's a federal agency called the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they have quite a bit of funding available to implement some of these practices. And we will include this contact information for all of these different groups in the email after we send out some more resources after webinars. So that is a quick overview. Thank you again, everybody. And I think we should have time for questions.
Yeah, we've got some questions in the chat box, and you can post more if you have them. We'll try to get through a few here. I think just while we're doing that, Jean, you have a poll for us for folks to provide some feedback on the program tonight? So Jean is going to post a poll for you all to respond to while we're going over the questions. So our first question is for Jamie, and it's, what is compaction like if you have cropland come out of 10-year tallgrass prairie CRP and revert it back to cropland? What would you expect to see happen with
Sure.
the
So make sure I'm off mute. So I put an answer in the chat box. So oftentimes it really depends upon how that CRP was managed. So when we look at CRP, not all are created the same. And the reason I say that is I spent many years ago tromping up and down switchgrass CRP in Lucas and Wayne counties, Iowa. And I can tell you that erosion was terrible in those bunch grass type systems. So it really depends upon what kind of CRP it is, whether you had a diverse mixture and how it was managed over time. But typically under most situations, we're going to expect a well-managed, diverse, permanent vegetation to always have, most of the time, have better soil health than any type of agricultural system. And you'll notice in my answer, when we do come out of that CRP, the key is to capture and maintain whatever benefits we have gained from that CRP. And so moving into an agricultural system that has a diverse rotation that reduces or eliminates tillage, as well as maintains that diversity either through another type of permanent vegetation such as pasture or through cover crops, is going to be ideal. So the soil liked to be, quote unquote, if it had an opinion, the soil liked to be under that permanent vegetation, that more natural vegetation. And our goal as agriculturalists are try to, we're never going to mimic it, but simulate it as best as we can with our agricultural situation to make sure that we are providing the water, air, nutrients, and structure and all that those organisms need to maintain soil health over time. So it's a complicated question, but there's my best general skirt around it answer. So, because the real answer is it depends. So, but I know everybody hates that answer. So
Thank
I gave you a longer version.
And we have a question for Linda. Let's say you're a landowner and you have somebody has livestock or are cropping some of your land. How would you know if your operation has a direct runoff issue? That's one of those issues you talked about that could mean you're not in compliance with some of the regulations. How would you know if you're not in compliance on your land?
Good question. So just having manure on your property doesn't necessarily mean you have a direct runoff issue. You're also taking into consideration your distance to streams, distance to the sinkholes, conduits to groundwater, or conduits to the stream. And then also looking at what is between you and these water quality management areas. So if it's completely grassed over, pasture buffer, and the water is sheet flowing over a pasture, you're less likely to have direct runoff. We're looking at channelized flow, channelized conduits to these water quality management areas. So we take into consideration your location, the mode of transportation that the manure is moving over your property, and the water resource that it's getting into, how close you are to those water resources.
And a few signs, just to add to that, a few signs of manure movement is like burned out vegetation. So if you see a channel where there's dead vegetation, sometimes after rainfall, you might see a little foaming in the culvert or in the ditch or something like that. Sometimes you can actually see the color of the manure. So those are just a couple of signs that there might be some nutrients moving.
Okay. Another question for Jamie. Jamie, are there ever any situations where tillage is necessary, maybe to increase oxygen levels or improve soil microbiology?
Yeah, I'm a practical type of person. So, there are situations where tillage is warranted. And so the key is making sure that it is warranted. So this is where you call someone out, your agronomist, you call out your land conservation, or you call out extension, and we help you evaluate where if the compaction is there, if it's natural or if it's man-made, and at what depths and how thick it is. But in certain situations, particularly, I showed you that picture of that heavy plow pan. We could wait for nature to take care of that through cover crop roots, but oftentimes we cannot wait that long, and we're gonna see that reduced productivity. And so there are times, and the key is to couple that tillage with another practice. And so for the example, with that plow pan, my recommendation is to subsoil. We're gonna go in and we're gonna deep rip at that. We're going to break up that plow pan. And then we're going to follow immediately with roots, followed by roots, followed by roots. So what I want to see is I want that artificial cracking of that plow pan. I want it to open up. I want to get those cracks, and I immediately want to put a root back into it so that that soil cannot collapse back upon itself and create that plow pan again. I could wait for nature to do that, but it would take decades. I can facilitate that process and speed that process up with well-timed and well-placed tillage, followed again by conservation practice, such as a cover crop. But it's going to be, the key with compaction is you need somebody who knows what compaction is and what they're looking at to help you come out and evaluate that. So oftentimes when I go out and people say that's compaction, it's just a natural soil layer and there's nothing I'm going to be able to do about it, or it's too deep, or it's too shallow, or it's something. You really need that expertise to go out there. And as Bill put in hi Bill, I knew Bill put in there, no recreational tillages. It's always targeted. There is a reason we are going out and putting that steel to the ground, and we are going to try and capture the benefits of that and maintain the benefits over the long term. So we do that through roots and changing our overall practices after that. So
Thanks, Jamie.
You
Thanks
betcha.
to all of our speakers tonight. Thanks to everyone who participated in this webinar. Remember, we have our final with lots more really interesting information, especially about leasing, on Monday night. So please join us on Monday. Anyone else have any other final notices or thoughts, or before we let folks go? Okay, thanks again, everybody, and hope to see most of you on Monday.
Look forward to that invite on Monday. See you then.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.
And Jean, you can stop recording.